Hi everyone, today we're looking at conservatism. This is our second ideology of 4. This lesson is going to look at the key concepts associated with conservatism and where conservatism comes from. Next lesson we'll look at the different strands, and the third lesson will be on the key thinkers. So just to start, you might want to have a go at this quiz. What kind of conservative are you? It's just a bit of fun. Some of the questions are geared towards sort of American themes, so some of them might seem a bit strange. But it would be good if you did that quiz and then looked at it once you've finished learning about conservatism to see if you think it's correct. So just some key terms. Some of these you'll know already, some of them are new. So the first one, change to conserve. So this is the idea that for something, if something's quite valuable and we want to preserve it, it should be updated and maintained. So you're changing something, an idea or a thing slightly in order to conserve it, to make sure it doesn't die out. So a good example might be the royal family. It's become less traditional as time has gone on in order to keep it popular. If it was still quite, stuffy and traditional as it was in the past, perhaps the public wouldn't see its value. So it's had to adapt in order to continue to be relevant. The second one, noblesse oblige. This is sometimes known as paternalism. Noblesse, if you think about that word, it sounds a bit like noble, and oblige sounds a bit like obligation. So it's the fatherly obligations that the nobility or the ruling class has to society as a whole. Human imperfection. So this is the idea that humans or humanity is flawed. And so if we start trying to have this quest for a perfect society, it's a bit misguided because we are innately flawed. Empiricism. So this is the idea that we should have evidence when making actions or decisions rather than making a decision based on theory. So it's an emphasis on what is over what should be. Hard paternalism is when we have the elites or those at the top of society deciding what is best for the rest of us, irrespective of what they actually want. So it's that idea that they know best. Soft paternalism is when the power resides with the elites in the same way that it does with hard paternalism, but elites would perhaps take into consideration what non-elites want, and there would be some degree of consultation between the ruling class and the rest in deciding what actions are taken. So you want to try and use some of these key terms in your essays, and they'll crop up in the next few lessons. So where does conservatism come from? So we know from when we studied liberalism that the Enlightenment was the belief in reason and progress and this striving for this so-called ideal society. But it was very difficult for politicians and philosophers to argue against the principles of the Enlightenment without appearing regressive, intolerant, or backwards. But by 1792, it was clear that revolutionary change, reason, and other Enlightenment ideals could have shocking consequences. This was seen in the public beheading of King Louis XVI and the period of what was called the Terror. So this was when lots of citizens were persecuted and executed because of this belief in progress. And these people did not fit with that idea of progress, so they were killed. So this gave sort of an avenue for criticism of Enlightenment principles and saying, well, actually, are these principles right? It's led to lots of killing. And that meant that people could be seen as critics of the Enlightenment principle, but not be seen as regressive or backwards. So it led to a new ideology that respects the case for change, but also warning of dangers, and to accept reform, but reject revolution. So small steps of careful, considered change rather than an upheaval and a radical change. So one of the core ideas of conservatism is pragmatism. So it's a flexible approach to politics, and that is involving making decisions based on what works for people at that current time. So concepts that liberals champion, like human rights and equality, are quite abstract concepts, and conservatives are sceptical of these concepts because they think that they can lead to a reordering of society that can have negative consequences. In some cases, ideas about human rights and equality don't work. So therefore, they avoid rigid ideological approaches to problems and instead prefer to act in a cautious, moderate way that considers tradition and history. And we'll come on to why they think tradition and history are so important later. They argue that we should change to conserve, so the idea society should adapt to changing circumstances with moderate reform. We shouldn't have a situation where change is rejected, because that could ultimately lead to the public rebelling. So there has to be small changes to our society in order to appease everybody. So, for example, lots of people are surprised when they learn that it was a Conservative government that introduced same-sex marriage. And arguably, this is, marriage is obviously a historic traditional institution. And that's why people often confuse. They're like, well, why would Conservatives that are perhaps founded on these principles of conservatism, why would they want to introduce something like that? Because it is a change. But ultimately, David Cameron was trying to preserve the tradition of marriage, making that small change, broadening it out to more people so that people still valued marriage. In 1951 to 64, there was a Conservative administration, and people often say, well, why didn't they get rid of the NHS? There's this badge associated with Conservatives that they don't like state ownership, but they didn't reverse the newly created welfare state, the NHS, even though they opposed some aspects of it initially, because they realised that this small change had, it was working. They were taking a pragmatic approach. Obviously, there might be some problems to taking a pragmatic approach all the time. So there's a question there, if you could try and answer it. So think about, what is the problem with making changes based on what's going on at the time. Why is it good sometimes to have a theory or an ideal of what society should look like? So the second concept is human nature. If you could please have a go at filling in the blanks. So pause the video here. The answers are on the next slide, so obviously don't look at the next slide when you do this. See if you can do it by yourself, and then check your answers. So here are the answers. We can see that, Conservatives have a very sort of negative view of human nature, and they think we're flawed. They also think that because we're flawed, we crave safety and security, and that's why Conservatives are very big on social order and a strong state to ensure that we have security and social order. Intellectually, humans do not possess the mental faculties to make sense of complex the complex modern world, so they need to draw on tradition and history and previous experiences to understand the world. And we'll look at, as I said, we'll look at tradition in a bit more detail. So on pages 48 to 49, which I've sent you, there's some information about Burke and Hobbes and their view of human nature. So they're both Conservatives, but they have slightly different views on human nature. So the information that you need is towards the end of page 48 and at the top of page 49. So just outline how they're similar and how they're different. So on to tradition. Conservatives believe strongly in the virtues of tradition and hold high esteem for the accumulated wisdom of the past. They essentially think that we can learn from history. It's the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. And so therefore it's important to learn from tradition, because, if you think about that concept of like the survival of the fittest, institutions that have survived over such a long period of time surely have value, otherwise they would have been replaced or abolished. So this is why Conservatives value things like the House of Lords, because it's an accumulated sort of branch of knowledge from history. It survived the test of time. Paternalism. So paternalism, we mentioned earlier, hard and soft paternalism. But essentially it's the idea that those at the top of society and those who lead us are best equipped because they have some sort of accumulated knowledge through their upbringing and their inheritance. So obviously we're not necessarily thinking about today's government, because that's not necessarily true. But back when conservatism first emerged, this was certainly true. It remains a key part of the Conservative Party. Under recent leaders, the Tories have sought to present themselves as a party that looks after everyone. So, that idea that the elite should be looking after those at the bottom. So when David Cameron was in power, he had the notion of the big society, and it helps to illustrate this theme of paternalism. So the big society was this idea that everyone should chip in to look after everybody in society, and he tried to get more people to do volunteering and things like that. However, those further to the right were critical of the moderate stance taken by Cameron for adopting a liberal and metropolitan agenda, contrary to the concerns of ordinary people. The origins of paternalism can be traced back to Disraeli. He said society was dividing into rich and poor, and the most privileged needed to recognise their obligation to look after the poor to ensure social cohesion and stability of the nation. So it's that idea of noblesse oblige. And this way, the elite can also maintain their wealth and their status in this way, and it almost sort of justifies their position at the top of society. So we already mentioned the difference between the two. Obviously, hard paternalism is more extreme compared to soft. If you look at these two examples, the top one sort of suggesting how much alcohol you should drink. That's an example of soft paternalism. It's a subtle intervention, a policy that's helping individuals to overcome their weaknesses of will, helping them to make the right decisions. Whereas the one at the bottom is hard paternalism. It's an instruction. Smoking is banned in public places, indoors. So it's the elite telling us how to live our lives. So think about what's problematic about paternalism. So think about laws in the past that banned homosexuality. If you think about that law, it's an elite small group telling a larger group how they should live their lives. What if that elite small group doesn't consider the interests of minorities? Obviously, they would be at a disadvantage. If you've got an elite making the laws of the land, they might end up making them in their own interests rather than the interests of others. So the next concept is the economy. So the two main strands of conservatism are divided over the economy. So the One Nation school of thought favours a degree of state intervention that helps to moderate or regulate the free market, so protectionism. And traditional conservatives believe that capitalism promotes risk and innovation, whereas they want to maintain order and stability. So capitalism can actually threaten order and stability because it's unpredictable. So they want some sort of managed free market system instead, so it can be controlled. On the other hand, the new right position on the economy is that it should be left alone and should be free from state interference, so that the laissez-faire economic principles that we learnt about when we studied liberalism. As the state is not interfering with the economy, it can do its role of providing security and order more effectively. And free market capitalism is sometimes referred to as Reaganomics. So I've got some approaches to the economy here, so that you might want to just read through those and say, what approach is it? A one nation or traditional approach, or is it more of a new right approach to the economy? So on page 54 to 56, there's some information about the different objectives of the state according to conservatives. So objectives to provide order and security, organic origins, a ruling class, and the nation state. If you could read through that information and just complete the table. And then lastly, if you could, as a task, explain in approximately 200 words how conservatism is different to liberalism. That's all for today. If you could just email that over to me by Friday, that would be great. Thanks, bye.